Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take the sources you've given us, really get into them, and pull out the key insights, maybe some surprises, basically the stuff that matters, just for you.
And today, we're looking at some really powerful material, excerpts from Bill Browder's book, Red Notice.
It's quite a story, isn't it? It goes way beyond just finance.
Oh, absolutely. It kicks off with this, almost gold rush mentality, seeking capitalist opportunities in post-Soviet Russia, which was, well, wild.
Right.
Then it moves through high-stakes finance, uncovering unbelievable corruption, and then through really tragic loss, it ends up transforming him, this financier, into a global human rights activist.
So that whole arc is just fascinating. So, okay, our mission for this deep dive, let's trace that journey. Let's try to understand the turning points, the massive risks he took.
Yeah, and how they push back against these incredibly powerful, corrupt forces.
Exactly, and pull out what we can learn from it all. So let's start at the beginning, because his background, it's kind of unexpected for someone who becomes this huge capitalist player in Russia.
It really is. The material you shared highlights his family history right away. His grandfather, incredibly, was the head of the American Communist Party.
The head, yeah, you can't get much further from Wall Street capitalism than that. And his father, a brilliant mathematician. So a very intense intellectual background.
Definitely. And the book seems to suggest some early experiences like struggles at boarding school, even getting expelled, maybe fueled this drive to succeed differently. He then got really focused on academics.
Which leads him to consulting, right? Bain and Company. Sounds like it was super intense there.
Yeah, the material describes it that way.
Yeah.
But it also sounds like he realized pretty quickly that the standard path, elite business school, climbing the corporate ladder, that wasn't really for him. He wanted something else.
A different kind of opportunity.
Exactly. And that's where Eastern Europe comes in. Maybe a bit ironically, given his grandfather's past, but he saw it as this overlooked niche, a place others weren't really looking at.
So his first real taste of it is, while he's still at Bain, an assignment in Poland, Sanok Bus Company. And the culture shock described there is, well, it's something else.
Oh, yeah. Those stories are memorable. Like, he's cold, asks for a heater, and the manager just winks and offers him a woman instead.
Right. Or the food descriptions. It just paints a picture of a world completely different from what he knew.
Definitely not your typical business trip comforts. Then he moves on, London, working for Robert Maxwell at BCG. Sounds like a really chaotic time.
Yeah, Maxwell's empire was collapsing, then Maxwell dies suddenly. The book makes you feel that scramble, him trying to just secure his bonus before it all imploded.
Total chaos after Maxwell's death, apparently. Bankers everywhere, reporters yelling about fraud.
Yeah.
Must have been quite an exit from that world.
So then he lands at Salomon Brothers, and the book paints that as just fiercely competitive. Dog eat dog.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like he struggled at first, trying places like Hungary, Poland, but finding it hard to get traction.
But he kept pushing, and eventually shifted his focus towards Russia. Politically dicey, maybe, but huge potential.
Untapped market, yeah.
And he gets this advisory job for the Murmansk trawler fleet. The budget detail really jumps out, only $50,000 for 2 months.
Wow, yeah. Peanuts in investment banking terms.
And his arrival sets the tone, right? Seeing a burned-out plane on the runway in St. Petersburg doesn't exactly scream efficiency.
No. But this trip, this is where he stumbles onto the big thing, the Russian privatization vouchers.
Ah, yes.
The book describes him realizing these things, given out free to citizens, were being traded for practically nothing, like $7 worth of vodka.
Or a bit of pork. It was this incredible fundamental mispricing. He saw it instantly. Anyone could buy these things, and they represented real stakes in huge companies.
That's the light bulb moment. So he goes back and somehow convinces Salomon Brothers to give him $25 million to invest.
Yeah, the book mentions this slightly odd relationship with a guy named Bobby Ludwig in New York, described as weird, but a big earner who could kind of bypass the usual rules.
Okay, so he gets the money, but investing it, there's no real stock market yet. How did that even work?
It sounds incredibly difficult. He talks about just cold calling companies, trying to figure out who held the shares, getting literally thrown out of an office at one point.
Wow. But they managed it, investing through these voucher auctions, building up stakes in massive companies, Lukoil, UES Electricity, Rostelecom.
Right. He ends up holding $25 million worth of shares he believed were worth far, far more.
And that success, presumably, is what makes him think, okay, I need to do this myself. Leave Salomon, start his own fund in Moscow.
Exactly. But then you need funding. The book mentions he first talked with Benny Steinmetz, and that somehow leads to this crucial meeting with Edmond Safra.
In France, right. At
Yeah.
Safra's villa, which sounds absolutely palatial, like maybe the most expensive house in the world.
Yeah, quite the setting. And Safra himself sounds like a character. Short attention span, always on the phone.
But he commits $25 million, despite the distractions.
And that's the birth of Hermitage Capital, the name he gives the firm. Then things get really interesting politically, 1996, the Russian election.
He's at Davos, the World Economic Forum, and actually meets the communist candidate Gennady Zyuganov.
Yeah, while all the oligarchs are apparently super confident Yeltsin's going to win, he feels like, hang on, I need to check out the front runner.
And he gets to talk to Zyuganov, who says some surprisingly reassuring things about respecting the privatization deals.
Which turns out to be really important. Because Yeltsin's polling was abysmal, like 5.6% initially, but then it starts climbing dramatically.
Right, up to 14%, then into the 20s. And the book explains that this shift, the growing chance of Yeltsin winning, is what finally makes Safra comfortable sending the money and letting the fund launch.
So, new money in hand, he finds what he calls the gold mine, Russian preferred shares.
Yeah, the MNPZ example. Preferred shares trading way, way cheaper than the ordinary ones for basically no good reason.
Makes no sense. So they pile the new capital into those.
And the results are pretty stunning. Up 40% in 3 months, 125% after Yeltsin wins.
Incredible returns. Total validation of the strategy.
But, of course, that kind of success doesn't go unnoticed, and it leads straight into the first big fight the book details, taking on the oil company, Sadanko, as a shareholder activist.
Right. He identifies Sadanko as way undervalued, loads of oil reserves, tiny market cap. So he starts investigating, goes to their fancy office, a former czar's mansion.
And the executive he meets just dodges all his questions about the reserves, right? Talks about drilling techniques instead.
Yeah, big red flag.
Then, bam, he's on vacation in South Africa. His wife made him go, apparently, and the news breaks. Sadanko is doing this massive share issue, super diluted, at a 95% discount. And guess what? Hermitage is excluded.
The hit is catastrophic. A $900 million loss, 90% of the fund's value just gone.
Oof. The book really conveys the shock, the feeling of being gutted, the public fallout.
But this is where things really shift. Instead of just folding, packing up,
He decides to stay and fight, to go to war, as the book puts it. Knowing how dangerous that was in Russia, people were warning him, even Safra.
and Safra's reaction is fascinating. He warns him about the danger, but then he sends his own security team, led by this guy Ariel Buzada, to protect Browder in Moscow. He backed the fight, even knowing the risks.
So the first move is public pressure. He goes after the oligarch involved, Potinin, calling him out directly, which, again, incredibly risky in that environment.
Absolutely. And they also try the official channels, asking the Russian regulator, the FSCC, to investigate the dodgy share deal. But it's uncertain, lots of delays. You don't know if the system will actually work.
But it does, kind of. The FSCC blocks the share issue, a partial win, but huge after that massive loss.
A crucial victory.
Yeah.
But then, just awful timing. The book recounts the news of Edmond Safra's death shortly after.
Yeah, the details sound so grim. A staged break-in, a fire, smoke inhalation. Safra was clearly a huge figure for him, a mentor, a terrible loss.
Definitely. So moving on from Sadanko.
Yeah.
The book paints this picture of Russia after the 1998 financial crash. The market's recovering slowly, but there's a problem.
The oligarchs are basically running wild, right?
Right.
Stealing from minority shareholders because all that Western investment that maybe kept them slightly in check, it dried up.
Exactly. And Hermitage is suddenly one of the last big foreign investors left. So Browder becomes this very public voice railing against the corruption. He gives this speech at the American Chamber of Commerce using Yuko's oil as an example, calling them the armed forces of corporate governance abuse. Very pointed.
Yeah. And this is also around the time he meets Elena, his future wife. The book mentions some early tension, like they disagreed on how the West should deal with the oligarchs. He thought they should be treated like pariahs.
An interesting personal dynamic starting there. But professionally, he sets his sights on an even bigger target, Gazprom.
The energy giant. Huge reserves, but again, tiny valuation. Why? Everyone just assumes massive theft is happening.
Right. But assuming isn't proving. They start digging, hearing these wild stories, maybe the largest theft in history, but they need hard evidence.
And then comes maybe the most unbelievable detail in the whole book. His colleague Vadim finds the Moscow Registration Chamber database being sold on a street corner for $5.
$5 for the keys to potentially billions in corporate secrets. It's incredible.
So they use this database, and bingo, they find proof. Assets have been stolen from Gazprom. Assets, the book says, were equivalent to all of Kuwait's oil reserves.
A mind-boggling amount of theft. But here's the twist.
Right. The really counterintuitive part. That massive theft, the Kuwait-sized chunk, was actually only 9.65% of Gazprom's total reserves.
Meaning over 90% hadn't been stolen. And almost nobody else knew that. The market just assumed the whole thing was rotten.
And the book points out this weird kind of protection he had through all this. Russian paranoia.
Yet people couldn't believe he was just an investor acting alone. They figured he must have backing from the CIA or MI6 or someone powerful, which, ironically, maybe kept him safer than he would have been otherwise.
So the Gazprom campaign works spectacularly well. Exposing the theft actually makes the stock price soar, a 1,200% recovery, the book says.
Incredible. He makes back all the losses from Sedanko and more. And the book describes this feeling of, doing good and making money. Fighting corruption was profitable.
But that success, that high profile, it leads to the next major turning point, and it's linked to Mikhail Khodorkovsky.
Ah, yes. Khodorkovsky challenges Putin, gets arrested. The book presents this as a very clear warning. Cross the government, and this is what happens.
And then Browder experiences it firsthand. November 2005, he flies back into Moscow, gets held at the airport VIP lounge for hours.
Stuck there. The book really conveys the fear, the uncertainty. Thinking about his wife Elena, pregnant, his son David, not knowing what was happening.
And then the next morning, he's put on a plane and deported. Gone.
He describes the relief on the plane as overwhelming. Even the bad airline food tasted amazing just because he was out.
He finds out the official reason. He's been declared a threat to national security, Article 27.
So not just a visa mix-up. This was serious, political, high level.
He tries diplomatic channels, right?
Yep.
The UK ambassador, various Russian officials. But nothing works, gets conflicting signals.
Until this anonymous source, Aslan, tells him flat out, the decision came from the top, the presidential administration. It's hopeless. Forget coming back.
Then the story breaks in the media. It's public now, and he knows that's it for Hermitage and Russia. The business is over.
The immediate problem becomes, how do we get our money out and our people? Quickly, but without causing a panic that crashes the investments. They needed to sell everything secretly.
Like avoiding a bank run on the fund, as the book puts it, finding a broker they could trust to do it discreetly, a huge logistical challenge.
Okay, so they managed to get the assets out. The key people leave. But then weird stuff keeps happening. Raids on the now empty Hermitage offices. Criminal cases opened against former employees like Ivan.
It doesn't make sense. If the money's gone, why are they still coming after Hermitage?
And this leads to the crucial insight. They weren't after the money that had left. They were after the companies themselves, the Russian subsidiaries that Hermitage technically still owned, even if they were just shells now. The ones involved back in the Sedanko mess.
Ah, okay. So this kicks off more legal work, led by their lawyer, Edward Kyrulin, and his firm, Firestone Duncan.
And they dig up evidence of these completely fraudulent lawsuits filed against the Hermitage shell companies, with massive judgments against them, adding up to $973 million.
$973 million in fake judgments. And this is where Sergei Magnitsky enters the story in a major way. He's a lawyer at Firestone Duncan.
Right. And Sergei starts looking into the tax side of these fake judgments. What could they be used for?
And he finds it. The bombshell discovery. Evidence that these fraudulent judgments, cooked up against Hermitage, were then used by the conspirators to claim a massive tax refund from the Russian government.
For the exact same amount. $973 million. The book lays out the evidence matching amounts, bank records showing the money flowing out to specific banks, like Intercommerce Bank.
It's unbelievable. The largest tax refund in Russian history, the book says. A brazen theft involving the very police officers Kuznetsov, Karpov, who raided Hermitage in the first place, plus complicit tax officials.
Just staggering corruption. So their decision seems clear. Expose it, file complaints against the officials involved, use the system to bring them to justice.
A decision that has devastating consequences. They file the complaints against officers Kuznetsov and Karpov, and almost immediately Sergei Magnitsky is arrested.
And the charge against him. Tax evasion. The very crime he had just uncovered and reported against the officials.
What's sickening? The book then details Sergei's time in pretrial detention, and it's just horrific.
Yeah, the conditions sound medieval. Fighting other prisoners for a mattress, freezing cold cells, disgusting sanitation, being moved constantly, denied basic things, all orchestrated by officials like Major Selchenko.
And the goal, the book makes clear, was to break him. force him to withdraw his testimony against Kuznetsov and Karpov.
While this is happening, the lawyers start getting serious warnings. Vladimir Pastakov tells them they need to flee Russia. Eduard Karulin, the lead lawyer, eventually has to go into hiding. The book describes his escape like something out of a spy novel, an evening stroll, a waiting black Audi.
They try everything to help Sergei from outside diplomacy, legal aid, but they hit brick walls. It becomes obvious this is political. They want him silenced.
But Sergei, his courage is just incredible. Despite getting sicker and sicker, pancreatitis, gallstones, appendicitis diagnosed but untreated, the awful mistreatment, he absolutely refuses to back down.
There's this powerful moment described in court where he just stands up and confronts the judge directly about the injustice.
Yet officials like Silchenko keep denying him essential medical care. It's deliberate cruelty.
Trying to get the word out. The book mentions they create this YouTube video. Hermitage reveals Russian police fraud. It gets a lot of views, helps raise awareness internationally.
But the threats continue. The lawyers get this chilling text message. What's worse, prison or death?
Then Sergei is moved to a prison hospital, Matrosskaya Tishina. And on November 16th, 2009, the news comes. Sergei Magnitsky is dead. He was 37.
Just devastating. And the cover-up starts instantly. The official story from Dudikina, no health complaints, sudden death. They try to revive him. It's all lies, contradicted by the evidence they gather later.
His poor family. They're denied an independent autopsy. His body is held, then released, and the book says it showed signs of being beaten.
They commission their own independent forensic report, and it confirms everything. Illegal arrest, torture conditions, denial of medical care, a cover-up. They send it to Russian authorities. Silence. No response.
But Sergei's prison diaries get published. His own words detailing the suffering become public.
At this point, it's painfully clear. There will be no justice for Sergei inside Russia. The system is completely corrupted.
So the book describes this shift. A new mission takes hold. Getting justice for Sergei outside of Russia. Creating a lasting legacy for him.
And this leads to the core strategy. The Magnitsky Act. The idea, inspired by an existing U.S. law, is basically targeted sanctions. Identify the specific individuals involved in Sergei's persecution and the fraud.
And ban them from traveling to the West, freeze their assets there, hit them where they live, essentially stop them from enjoying their stolen money in London, New York, the south of France.
Makes sense. But getting it done in Washington, D.C. wasn't easy. The book talks about hitting bureaucratic resistance, skepticism from State Department officials like Kyle Scott initially.
But they find allies. Senator Ben Cardin hears the story, gets on board. That's a huge step.
So the legislative wheels start turning. Cardin introduces a global human rights bill. Chris Smith introduces a Russia-only version in the House. There's debate, back and forth.
And meanwhile, Russia fights back hard in Washington, lobbying efforts, trying to smear Sergei and Browder. The book mentions Alexander Malkin's testimony failing, rumors of pressure from high places, even mentioning John Kerry.
But then comes some clever political maneuvering in the U.S. The repeal of Jackson-Vanik, this old Cold War trade restriction that Russia really wanted gone.
Gets tied directly to passing the Magnitsky Act. Key senators like Lieberman make it happen. That creates real leverage.
And it works. The House passes the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act in November 2012. Overwhelmingly. 89% support.
Wow. Then the Senate, after some last-minute haggling over the Russia-only version, passes it in December 2012.
And finally, December 14, 2012, President Obama signs it into law. The book describes that moment as just huge relief, vindication, immensely emotional after everything.
But the fight isn't over. Predictably, Putin's regime reacts furiously.
Immediately, and with shocking cruelty. The book highlights how, on the exact same day the Magnitsky Act is signed, Russia passes a law banning U.S. citizens from adopting Russian orphans.
Using vulnerable children as political pawns. Just awful retaliation.
And Putin himself makes it personal. At a press conference, he lies about Sergei's death, calls Browder a criminal by name. It's clear this has hit a nerve.
Then comes the truly bizarre move. Russia puts Bill Browder and Sergei Magnitsky on trial, in absentia. Sergei, obviously, being tried after his death.
It sounds completely surreal, but the book explains the twisted logic. They needed a Russian court conviction, however bogus, to wave around in Europe and argue against other countries passing their own Magnitsky laws. He describes watching the trial feed, a prosecutor talking to an empty cage meant for Sergei.
Unbelievable. And they also try to use international bodies. Interpol. Russia gets them to issue a red notice for Browder, basically an international arrest warrant.
Which was been terrifying. The book mentioned the anxiety crossing borders, never knowing if you'll be detained. They had to fight hard to convince Interpol this was politically motivated.
Interpol has a history of being misused by dictatorships, the book notes.
Thankfully, in December 2013, Interpol agrees. They delist Browder, acknowledging the political nature of the warrant. A really important precedent.
But the work continues. Pushing for similar laws in Europe, other countries, the book mentions the European Parliament voting on a sanctions list in 2014.
And then, another dramatic twist. A whistleblower emerges. Alexander Parapoligny.
Right. He contacts the team with evidence, bank records, linking the stolen $973 million tax refund money directly to luxury properties and accounts belonging to Olga Stepanova,
Who was head of the tax office involved in the fraud and wife of a judge also implicated. Basically, proof of where the money went.
The book touches on the team wondering, is this guy for real? Could he be an FSB plant? But his story checked out. He claimed Stepanova turned on him with a tax case when he wouldn't help cover up losses, forcing him to flee Russia.
And then, tragically, Parapoligny drops dead while jogging near his home outside London, November 2012, just days before the Magnitsky Act vote in the U.S. Senate.
Suspected poisoning. The book mentions the police investigation, which sounded slow and complicated.
It just hammers home the danger. The book ends emphasizing the ongoing threat from Russian state actors, from organized crime, and the constant need to protect people who helped expose the truth.
So as we wrap up this deep dive based on the sources you shared, that transformation really stands out, doesn't it?
It really does. From this laser-focused capitalist, all about the deal, the profit, to someone utterly consumed by the fight for justice, for human rights, driven by what happened to Sergei.
He describes it himself, right? His old life felt like watching TV in black and white.
Yeah. And this new life, fighting for justice, felt like widescreen color TV. More meaningful, more vivid, more satisfying despite the danger.
So, reflecting on this whole story, we've gone from the wild east of Russian capitalism, uncovering corruption on a scale that's hard to fathom, through immense financial loss, the horrific death of Sergei Magnitsky, and then sparking this global accountability movement.
And some of those details just stick with you. The $5 database, the $973 million tax refund scam, that weird preferred shares loophole, Sergei being arrested for the crime he exposed, trying a dead man, the adoption ban retaliation, the Interpol fight.
It's an incredible narrative, and connecting it back to you, the listener, what can we take away? It forces you to think about how global finance, the rule of law or lack thereof, and basic human rights are all tangled together.
Yeah, and the very real, very high personal cost of challenging powerful, entrenched interest. It also shows how your life, your purpose, can pivot dramatically when you're confronted by profound injustice.
It's a story that started with money, risk, investment, but became about truth, accountability, and human dignity.
Which leaves us with a pretty big question to think about, doesn't it? In our interconnected world where money flows so easily, how do we actually weigh financial opportunity against our moral responsibilities? How do we balance making a living with standing up for what's right, especially when the stakes are so high?